So now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our presenter and speaker today, Professor Patricia Rogers from RMIT University. Patricia is Professor of Public Sector Evaluation and also a Project Director for the BetterEvaluation Network. Excellent evaluation resources there. And she has worked in public sector evaluation and research for more than 25 years. So really sound experience there with government, the UN, private sector, and so on. So Patricia, without further ado, I'll hand over the presenting to you.
Yeah. And thank you, Nicola. And it is such a delight to be here today with you, presenting on impact evaluation and having an opportunity to discuss some of those issues with you. I just wanted to, it would be good just to check again if the audio is working well. I see, Thadio, you're having some trouble with connectivity in South Sudan. Hopefully that will be enough for you to participate today. If it's not, as Nicola was saying, the recording will be available to access at times when you'll be able to have better access. So Nicola, can you hear me okay? Is that working? Okay. I want to acknowledge the other partners to this project. Thank you, Mohammed, for letting me know. That's great. I want to acknowledge the other partners in this this project, and particularly also the Office of Research, who oversaw this work, were incredibly active in contributors in that, making sure that we were focusing on issues of concern to UNICEF, really linking it to UNICEF examples and bringing in a large advisory board of UNICEF staff from different offices to really check the content of the briefs, and that involved the evaluation office and the data and analytics section and the program division and many country and regional offices, and that was enormously helpful for us in making sure we were speaking to the important issues. So the starting point for me is what I see on a plane very often. I've been a supporter personally of UNICEF for many years. When I fly Qantas out of Australia or into Australia, they're always collecting money for UNICEF, and I'm always contributing. I think it's a terrific cause and I'm pleased to support it. And I'm also really interested in what they say on their envelopes. And I'm not sure if you can read that one. This one is talking about that if you contribute some money, you can buy pencils and exercise books for school children. And it's pretty clear to draw the theory of change there, that if children have school supplies, they're likely to improve their learning. So that one's pretty easy. And then on the back of it, it talks about providing clean water and blankets and vaccinations. And again, they're very clear to see why this is going to make a difference. But UNICEF clearly does not just do those sorts of projects, and for many of them it's much harder to both understand the impacts that are being achieved and to communicate them succinctly. And that's particularly when the impacts are longer term, when they're harder to measure, and when UNICEF doesn't have a direct service delivery role where you can see the causal contribution really clearly, but in fact is working with national governments, other agencies, communities to implement programs and to build capacity so that they can implement them. These sorts of programs are really important, and it's very important for us to know, do they work? How do they work? How do we make them work better? For whom do they work? For whom don't they work? And yet a lot of our traditional approaches to impact evaluation really can't handle those sort of systemic level interventions or whole of government, whole of system interventions. So this is what really drives me. And the other thing is, when I've turned over this envelope, this is, you'll see, as an old envelope, and it used this line at the top that said, for every $1 spent on a child, the whole community benefits sevenfold. Now, this comes from a particular study in the USA on early childhood development that did do a random assignment and tracked children over a long time, and found that those who were involved in an early childhood program had lower levels of involvement in the welfare system, the justice system, and all of this saved the community money. So it's a really interesting study, but it doesn't sum up the sort of work that UNICEF does. but it's a great line, and it's very compelling, but it's actually not accurate to use it for UNICEF. So this puzzled me for a long time and bothered me. And this is an old envelope that's no longer used. They no longer make that claim. And so I'm really delighted to be in some way working with you in your work to say, how do we understand our impact better? Because, you know, if these systemic level programs are not working, you need to do something else or do them differently. And if they are working, you need to learn from that about how to make them work in other places. So I really do hope that these briefs, videos and webinars really help with that. So clearly there's a lot of work going on in UNICEF doing work on impact evaluation and covering all sorts of sectors and scales of projects. And they're trying to get more detailed answers and understanding these impacts of these messier sorts of projects. And I just want to talk about one as an example. This was one that the Office of Research was actually involved with, and it was the Zambia Child Grant Evaluation, and it was studying the impact of an unconditional cash transfer to families with a child under 5. Now, because of the nature of that, it was possible to roll that out early in some communities. So they randomly assigned communities and then they took a sample of those communities. And they used a theory of change to both plan the intervention and particularly to plan their data collection. So they were able to identify the intermediate outcomes that would come in fairly early and then the longer term impacts that were the reason for doing the program. And they also could identify intermediate factors that might influence it. And so by collecting this data, they were not only, sorry, I have to get my water. They were not only able to identify that overall had worked and that it was worth rolling out to the whole, you know, on a larger scale, but how it worked, what were some of the critical factors that made it work, and they were able to get some indicators of likely impact by looking at the intermediate outcomes. So this is a sort of example of the sorts of things that have been done. But looking across a lot of these different impact evaluations, there were quite different methods and approaches and designs used because of the nature of what was being evaluated, because of the resources available. So before we go any further, I'd like to ask you a question. So we just get some understanding of who's here today. So just thinking about yourself, what experience have you previously had with impact evaluation? Have you actually conducted one, gone out, collected data, analysed it, reported? Have you managed one? Have you done both, managed and conducted, or have you done neither? So I'm going to pass back to Nicola and she's going to take this as a poll.
Okay, so we're going to do a poll quickly, so just a moment while I get that up on the screen. And then if you could vote so that you can tell us what your experience with impact evaluation is. Okay, so you should see the poll on your screen now. So just let us know, click on basically which of the statements applies to you. Taya, you say 4 is your option. Can you actually click on it? So we have, Patricia, we have 24 responses at the moment. So that's a lot of people answering, 25. 56% say neither. They have not conducted or managed an impact evaluation. 24% have managed one, and 20% have actually conducted one. So it's a pretty good reflection. So I'll pass over to you to keep presenting now.
Right. Thanks very much, Nicola. I just think that's really helpful to know. And we're interested in any comments or questions that you There we go. We've got it back again. Thank you. I've got the presentation back. Interested in any questions or comments that you have throughout. So if you type those into the window, the message window, we'll pick those up at the end and go through those. And so we're interested, in those different perspectives of people who've actually been there doing it, people who've been overseeing it, and people for whom this is new. And you'll have a lot of different sorts of questions. So hopefully this will, for those people who've done neither, provide an overview and a way to think about impact evaluation and to then learn more from the briefs and other webinars. So I want to just give an overview of the briefs because it's a way of starting to think about impact evaluation, and then I'll take you through a sort of step-by-step process about managing an impact evaluation. The briefs are really organised in ways that I think are helpful for thinking about impact evaluation. And we refer to this as the wall just because they're sort of all stacked on top of each other. But you see the bottom layer, the green layer. These are what we really see as the building blocks of impact evaluation. So if you're starting to read them, the first one, which gives an overview, is obviously the place to start, and that's what this webinar really focuses. It gives that overview. Then there's one that looks at a theory of change. It's really important to revisit the theory of change that's been developed and then make sure you use that in the impact evaluation. So we'll talk about that a little today, and there'll be a separate webinar on that. Another building block is evaluative criteria. How do you judge success? Remember, this is evaluation. It's not research. It's got values in it. It's not enough to say we achieved 37%. You have to say, well, was 37% good? Was it good enough? Was it better than the alternatives? You have to ask evaluative questions. So there's two briefs that talk really specifically about evaluation. And for a lot of people, these are an absolute eye-opener. The evaluative criteria is the criteria by which you judge success. And many UNICEF impact evaluations use the OECD DAC criteria around effectiveness, efficiency, sustainability, impact, and others use other types of criteria. The one that comes after that is evaluative reasoning, and that talks about how do you bring together the criteria and the evidence, the data that you have to form those judgments. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in this session, but there's a whole brief on that. And then the other one we see as a building block for UNICEF is the whole notion of participatory approaches. And we'll talk a little bit about that today. There are participatory approaches in terms of who does the evaluation, who collects the data, who creates the data, but also in terms of who controls the evaluation, who makes the decisions, who's intending to use it. And there'll be a separate webinar on participatory approaches. So we see these as the building blocks. The second layer are all around how do we do the causal inference in impact evaluation. So again, there's an overview one that we'll be doing a separate webinar on, and that also has an animated video on. And then there are three particular briefs. One looks at a particular approach called randomised control trials. That is a way of doing impact evaluation by creating a control group where people are randomly assigned to either get the project or some alternative, what's currently existing or nothing. The key in that is about randomisation. They have to be randomly assigned to be a randomised control trial, and you can randomise at the level of individuals, households, communities, organisations, states, and so on. So that's one level, and there's a brief and an animated video on that. The second brief in that, the third brief in that row are quasi-experimental, and that's where instead of being able to randomly assign people, you have an existing group, and so we call them comparison groups. And there are a number of different designs there where again you're comparing those who were involved, those who received a program and those who didn't, but you haven't been able to randomise. And so there's a particular brief on that. And then the last one in that group.
So Patricia, some people, the slides are not moving for them. I'm wondering if you can click on the Take Over Us Presenter button at the top of your screen so that people can actually see your screen.
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much.
And otherwise, just if you could tell us what slide we should be looking at. So I have slide 5 on my screen. Okay, good. Now I have slide 6. Yeah. So that's great, but now we can't hear you, Patricia. Okay, so Patricia, maybe if you can try, we can see you back online.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yeah, so we can't, that's fine. We can't see you, but we can hear you, so just keep presenting. Great.
Okay, good. Well, you've seen what I look like. I'm a real person. So. I'm getting a bit of feedback, Nicola, so you might just need to mute yours perhaps now. Thank you. Thanks for fixing that up. We need to know where you were from. So you should be able to both see and hear now. This is just trying to give a bit of the logic of the briefs, that we have some building blocks about some essential ideas about impact evaluation. The middle layer is, how do we deal with cause and effect? How do we know that this is actually, that what the changes we've seen are because of the UNICEF program? And there's different ways of doing that, and we have a number of briefs. And then across the top we have a number of briefs on collecting and analysing data. So we have an overview one, we have one that focuses on measures of child wellbeing, which is very important obviously for UNICEF. We have one on interviewing, which is at the heart of a lot of most impact evaluations will have some information coming from interviews, and then one on modelling. So that they're not by any means all of the methods. There's a lot more methods in the overview brief, but this focuses on some of particular interest. So that's an overview of the briefs. What I'm looking at today is really taking you through that very first one, which provides an overview. And what I'll do shortly is take you through a process of thinking about how you go about managing an impact evaluation. But I want to start by talking about what we mean by impacts. I'm just going to make sure I get this chat up good. Good. Okay, so it seems to be working. All right, so let's just, before we start talking about impact evaluation and how you do it, let's talk about what it is. So first of all, with impact, there is a real tendency for people to just focus on their direct intended impacts. So it's, so impact evaluation becomes, did you achieve what you aimed to achieve? Not just did you do the activities, but did you have the results that you were after? So if this, I read one on child-friendly schools that was meant to really improve children's learning and their retention at school and their literacy and their numeracy. So the impact evaluation doesn't just say, did we implement the program? It says, did the children learn better? Has their literacy improved? And so this is a really important part of an impact evaluation, to look at these sorts of impacts, but it's really not enough. And when you're looking at developing up the terms of reference for your impact evaluation, obviously you're really interested in whether you achieved your goals, but you really must look at the others. So what else can there be? Let me just get this so I can advance it. Okay. You need to also have the unintended impacts. Now these can be positive or negative. Often if you're doing a capacity building program, for example, in one particular sector, you might be strengthening organisations that do things that have impacts in other sectors as well, other types of outcomes. Or you're doing work for households, but it has benefits for children, or benefits for children and it has wider impacts for the adults as well in the families and the households. So positive ones, you want to make sure you pick those up, because that's part of then, in the end, saying, was it worth doing it? But you also must look at negative impacts. You should be trying to anticipate those as you go through, and you must be having some capacity to pick up the negative impacts. I think it's an absolute ethical obligation to be doing that, and it means that in addition to having very focused evaluations looking at your goals, you must have some capacity to be surprised by unintended impacts. You also need to look at the direct and the indirect impacts. So the direct ones, particularly service delivery, if you're distributing blankets and vaccinating children and giving them school supplies, it's very direct to see the use of that. But the indirect is where you're building capacity, say, within a government department to develop a policy on child rights that then has to be implemented and has to have an effect on service delivery. You're looking there at the ripple effects of what you do. And UNICEF might not be involved all the way down that chain, they might be really just involved at the start. So that's thinking about the impacts. Therefore, the corollary around that in terms of your impact evaluation is that an impact evaluation is not measuring whether you achieved your impacts. It's understanding the range of important impacts. And so to do that, you have to understand what changes have occurred, and you have to be able to understand if they have been at least partly caused by UNICEF, and then you have to put a value on them. Are they positive or negative? Do some people see it as positive and others see it as negative? Was it significant? Was it large? Or critically important? Or not? I'll leave impacts now and talk about these steps. And what I'm going to do for the rest of the presentation is really walk through this process. To start by the process of deciding to conduct an impact evaluation, not assuming that it's always appropriate. The second one is setting up your governance and management arrangements. Who needs to be involved in the decision making about this evaluation? Get them involved at the start. Getting ready to conduct the evaluation, framing up what it really needs to do, and then 4, turning that into a terms of reference. In many cases, you'll be recruiting an external evaluation team. Even if you had an internal team, it's really important to document what are the terms of reference, what's in scope, what's out of scope. 5 is where you select and engage the evaluation team, and 6 is the whole process of overseeing the conduct of it. And then 7 is following it up. So I'm going to talk about each of these in turn, and then we'll take some questions. With this decision about whether you should be doing an impact evaluation at all, start by being very clear about the use that's likely to be made of it. Impact evaluations tend to be expensive, take a lot of resources, and you shouldn't just be doing them because it's become fashionable. You should be very clear about the use. So some people confuse the terms formative and summative with process and impact evaluation, and I want to be clear about that in terms of how you might use an impact evaluation. So an impact evaluation is one that evaluates impacts. That's it. How you use it can vary. So you can use an impact evaluation for formative purposes. Now, formative means it's around improvement. So if you have a program that's been running some time and the decision is saying, how do we make it better? You might do an impact evaluation and find somewhere in the causal chain some bits are breaking down and you're not getting the results you need. And so you will go and improve the implementation and get better results. If this is a program that's ongoing, you could well use it for formative purposes and use it to improve or even reorient it, really recast how it should go. The other way you can use an impact evaluation is for summative purposes, and that's where the decision is, should we continue this or should we discontinue it? Should we replicate it? Should we run it somewhere else? Or should we scale it up? So these questions are really asking, does it work? Is it worth it? For whom and in what ways does it work? So think about how you're planning to use your impact evaluation and then whether that's going to be justified in terms of when that decision is going to be made. And also think about who's going to use it and what their needs will be and what they would consider a timely evaluation. When will they be making this decision? And what would be a credible evaluation? The second thing to think about is the resources. Balancing out what you need to get adequately credible and comprehensive findings between the resources that are needed. And the resources are not just the budget to engage the external evaluator. It takes a lot of internal resources to plan, oversee, manage, follow up and impact evaluation. So that's sometimes less visible, but these are really critical resources. You also often need inputs from technical experts. You need field staff to help with data collection, and then you've actually got people's time and the time before a decision is needed. So really be very hearted about is it going to be worth it, and can you really do that? What do you need to do to mobilise the resources? Oh, okay, I've got a bit of a problem. Nicola, this is not advancing. So I should be moving on to 12, but it's just stuck on 11.
Okay. Are you able to just speak to slide 12?
Sure, I'll do that. I'll stop presenting.
We will make the PowerPoint available later on.
Sure. Let me see if I can get this up. Here we go. Manage presentable. There we go. And I'll present it now. I'll see if I can reload it. Nope, it's not loaded. That's very weird.
Do you want me to
Would you try it, please?
Okay, so I'm now on slide 12. So you do the audio and you tell me when to move the slides.
Right, that's going to be tricky because I've actually had them building up. So perhaps if you just click through, you'll see. I mean, the other thing is obviously how strategically important is this? Thinking about the national and the UNICEF priorities. UNICEF has particular priority areas, and you might think about the scale of the investment and focus your impact evaluations where you're making a big investment, but also the risk of the investment. It might be an area where, for example, if there were negative impacts, that could be potentially very serious, and you have a big knowledge gap. All right, and so that would then become a priority. So don't just, I think people sometimes talk about using a certain percentage of money for impact, for evaluation, you know, is it 5% or 10%? That's really not the way to make best use of your evaluation money. Really think about where do we need to focus this? Where are we likely to get the most value for our investment? Purposes of it. So Nicola, you're using this now at the moment, is that right? You're presenting? So if you could just put up all the sections of that slide, I think that would be helpful. So if you click that a few times, I think the different headings will come up. Nicola, can you click the other headings on that one, please? Or has it frozen for you as well? Okay. Right. So that's your first point, is thinking about deciding to conduct an impact evaluation, thinking about the timing, thinking about the resources, thinking about the purpose, thinking about the likely value of it, and actually making a deliberate decision to do impact evaluation. One of the things I've really noticed, that as there's been more discussion about impact evaluation, particularly in development, that sometimes people want to jump to an impact evaluation, and maybe you're not ready to do that. Maybe you should be doing some process evaluation, really helping people to improve the quality of implementation and get things running well before you do a big summative impact evaluation. I read a lot of impact evaluations, and often what the summary results is, when you don't do something well, it doesn't work. Now, that's not worth spending $1 million to find out. What you want to do is actually have a really strategic approach to this, so that you work to get programs that are running, you know, where the implementation bugs have been ironed out, and then you say, when it works well, well, first of all, can we get it to work what we think is well, and then when it works well, does it work? So I'm going to, Nicola, are you having trouble advancing this as well? Because I need to now go to slide 13. Perhaps I shall come back and take it back and see if I can get that to work. And you know, of course, this worked really well in the trial. So I will
So Patricia, we can see your screen now. We see slide 12.
Right, and it won't advance for me. That's the problem. Okay, so we can't go beyond that. Nicola, perhaps I can go back to you, and you can try reloading the presentation, and I'll keep talking about the points.
Yeah, okay.
Is that possible?
We can do that.
Okay. So let's say you've thought about this now. You've decided that an impact evaluation is the way to go. Nicola, can you just mute yourself, please, so that we don't get feedback? Thanks. So the second stage is to establish the governance and management arrangements, and it's really worth thinking about three different teams here. You have a team who's actually doing the impact evaluation, they're conducting it, and they would have technical and practical skills to do that. You have a evaluation management team, and they are the ones who oversee it, and they're the decision-making team. They're often also practically involved as well, helping set up field work and liaising there. They develop the terms of reference, they select the evaluator, they do quality assurance, they oversight that quality assurance process. They set the budget, and they approve any changes in the evaluation plan. So they're the decision-making group. And then the third group you might have a reference group, an evaluation reference group, and they might provide technical advice, cultural advice, and oversee and advice. They don't have a decision-making role. Now, in terms of participation could be in any of those three groups. They could be you could have members of the community or the national government involved in actually conducting the evaluation. They could be part of the decision-making evaluation management team, and they could be part of the evaluation reference group. So when you're thinking about participation, think about the different roles, the different types of participation that they can have. So it's very important to get these people involved early on so they can be involved in drawing up the terms of reference. So once you've assembled your people, then you need to start to get ready to conduct the evaluation. And I see a number of elements in that, and these are all set out in the brief. Nick, if you really want to see the visuals as we go, Nicola has put a link for downloading them from Yammer. So if you'd like to do that, you can. So now you're thinking, you've got your team on board, you want to get ready to conduct the evaluation. Start by reviewing the theory of change. Now, this should have been developed as part of planning the program or the policy, but it's really important to review it. Sometimes things have moved on, and so it no longer is the best thinking. Sometimes it's an overview, but there's a lot of material, a lot of detail in it worth bringing out. And sometimes it actually missed something important from the start. So there's a lot of good reasons to review your theory of change, and then to use that to inform the impact evaluation. So, Nicola, that looking good. Could we go to slide 15, please? Excellent, thank you. That's really good. Okay, so we do have the slides on the screen, and we have the bits popping up. So you can use it to identify the relevant variables. So we saw that in the Zambia impact evaluation, where they identified what those intermediate variables were, and then they worked out ways of getting information about those. It can look at any relevant variables, but it's particularly useful for those intermediate outcomes. It can help you to identify aspects of implementation that need to be there. So if for example, there might be a grant that's been made available. What's the take-up rate been? How many people know about it? How many information sessions were actually run? So you can actually start to identify aspects of implementation that you should look at. You should identify the contextual factors that should be included in the data collection. It should guide your data analysis. Think about the sort of disaggregations you should do, what sort of patterns you should look for. And it can often provide a really useful framework for reporting your findings, so that it actually tells a coherent narrative about how it works or how it doesn't work, and why it doesn't work, or why it works for some people and not for others. And there's a separate brief on theory of change, and we'll have a separate webinar on that. Can you go to the next slide, please, Nicola, 16? The other thing you need to do when you're getting ready is to identify and mobilise the resources, and they're not just your funding, but also all this group of internal people and their time, making sure that you have people who will commit to follow through. If they're going to be on an evaluation reference group, that they actually can commit to that process. and making sure you have good access to data systems. And sometimes that takes time to set up when people have data systems that don't talk to each other. So make sure you've got your resources in line. Yes, next slide, please. Another thing to do at this stage is to think about your methodology. Who is going to come up with your methodology and at what stage? So there's a number of options that were set out here. Sometimes it's entirely appropriate for the evaluation management group to really set out the design, and it's set out in the terms of reference, and then the evaluators pretty much are expected to implement that. That's appropriate when you've had previous evaluations that have used a particular methodology and have really done a lot of that groundwork. They've identified good measures, they've trialled them. You really want to use similar measures if they're going to be appropriate in this other evaluation. So sometimes that's appropriate. At the other end, you might actually ask for input from your evaluation teams. You might say, here's what we want to know, this is the sort of budget we've got, how would you design it? And you actually ask them to do that. You might ask them to do that as part of their response to the terms of reference, or you might do a two-stage process where you actually engage someone to develop the design. So if it's a new area, if you actually need a lot of technical expertise and you don't have it, maybe you need to engage some evaluators to do the design. And then there are variations on that where you might have an initial design and teams can come back with alternative proposals, or you might start with an initial design and the first thing they do in the inception report is to see how feasible that will be and, if necessary, revise it. So you need to decide this before you get to your terms of reference, so you know how much detail to have in your terms of reference. Now we can go on to terms of reference. So the fourth step on the next slide is to set this out in a terms of reference. It should clarify the purpose and the objectives. Why are you doing this evaluation, this impact evaluation? What is it of? You need to specify the key evaluation questions. You set out a design or some guidance on a design, and you specify the evaluation team profile. What would be the expertise that you need? So let's look at those briefly now. On the next slide, we talk a little bit about key evaluation questions. These are often linked to the OECD DAC evaluation criteria, but it's not a matter of just turning each of the criteria into a question. Was it relevant? Was it effective? Was it efficient? What impact did it have, and was it sustainable? You need to really go back again to the use that's going to be made of it and turn them into meaningful questions. So we have a separate brief where we've really looked a lot at turning these criteria into meaningful impact evaluation questions. So if you're developing a terms of reference, I really recommend that brief as a way of getting some questions that you might be able to use as a springboard to develop your own questions. And don't have like 30 or 50 key evaluation questions, right? It's not a questionnaire. These are the high-level questions that you really need an answer to. Next slide, please. The other issues in terms of questions is to think about the types of questions that you're asking. And I think it's helpful, to think about this in terms of three aspects to an impact evaluation. First of all, they have to identify the changes, and that's sometimes for individuals, sometimes for households or families or communities or organisations. So first of all, identify what are the changes you're interested in and what might be some other ones that come up. And then you have to understand what's caused them. And then you have to evaluate whether they're positive or negative and take into account equity issues. So you might have a program that on average has been really effective, it's really improved literacy, but in fact it hasn't worked for your most disadvantaged children. And so what you've done is actually increase the gap between your best and worst readers in a school. So those issues you need to look at. You need to look at evaluative ones. You need different types of methods for each of those different ones because you've actually got different types of questions. If we go to the next one, please. These different types of questions lead to different design options, and your impact evaluation will have elements of each of these three. So if you go to the next one, to look at options for answering descriptive questions, this is where that sort of blue line of the briefs comes in. some of the examples is to collect data from individuals or groups, to make observations, to do physical measurements, to use existing documents and data, and so on. The first brief in this has a lot more methods here. And these are all for answering descriptive questions. And they answer things like what's happened, what have been the changes. It's description. And you need to think about what measures and indicators you'll use, what qualitative data you use, what sort of sampling you'll do. If we go to the next slide, we have some quite different options for answering causal questions. And we need to think about what sort of cause and effect relationship have we got? Have we got attribution, where the intervention causes the effect, and we can attribute that effect totally to the intervention? And most of the work that UNICEF does is not like that. Most of the time we're talking about a contribution. We're saying the intervention produced the effect in conjunction with other causes. UNICEF's efforts worked in conjunction with the efforts of the national government or other agencies, or the work that the community was doing. And so it's not about who did it, it's about how we did it together. And the three clusters of ways of doing that are the experimental, with the random assignment, the quasi-experimental, where you have a comparison group, and non-experimental, where you use other methods, other designs, other logics to do that causal inference. And we have a more detail of that in the brief that gives the overview. And then the third type, which is on the next slide, it's about options for answering evaluative questions. So let's just put this little puzzle here. Let's say you're comparing two options for a program, and one of them is really good on the intended impacts. In fact, you give it 2 ticks, it's so good, but it did have some negative impacts. Whereas option 2 wasn't as good as on the intended impacts, but it didn't have any negative impacts. So which is the better option? Well, obviously it depends how bad the negative impacts are, and it depends how much better the intended impacts were. But that logic of thinking that through is an evaluative issue, and we have a whole brief on evaluative reasoning that's about thinking about these trade-offs, thinking about how do you balance out these comparisons and form an overall judgment about the merit or worth of a program. So when you're thinking about your methods, your design is going to have to address each of these, and so your key evaluation questions should also reflect that. So now you've got your terms of reference, and you want to engage the evaluation team, and you want to be very confident that you're going to get a good team. So your good practices are basic things like giving people enough time to respond to your terms of reference. Okay, I see a lot of terms of reference go out on international discussion lists that give people less than a week to respond, and then they're expected to be in the field the following week. Now, you've massively reduced the field of who you can get in there to do that work. That's not often such a problem with impact evaluations. There's usually a bit more lead time, but making sure you allow the opportunity to put a really good team together is important. So give people time and identify what sorts of knowledge you want people to have. Do they need to have good understanding of local culture, local language? Do they need particular types of data collection experience? Do they need evaluation expertise so they can do this, drawing it together? And what sort of project management expertise do they have? And if you're asking people to assemble a multidisciplinary team, how much time are you giving them to do that and to develop ways of working together? And so the participatory approaches brief talks about this a little bit more. So hopefully you've got the right team on board. You then want to oversee the evaluation. Help them to develop an evaluation work plan that turns the design into nuts and bolts, a Gantt chart of what will be done by when. Help oversee reporting findings and the management response. And then the final step is following up the evaluation. Oh, sorry, as part of the overseeing the evaluation, you need to think about your quality. Be thinking about the trade-offs between the different aspects of what you're trying to do. You might say, we could be more comprehensive with another year, but we need to have an answer this year in order to inform this decision. We will trade off some certainty for getting it in time to inform the decision. Get lots of input from different stakeholders who can provide advice on how to improve your evaluation. Get formal review of the design and the draft reports and think about who can provide that review, and make sure there's consideration of the ethical standards throughout. And then the final one is to follow up the evaluation. Make sure the findings get out to the people who can use them. Track whether there's been follow-up. If there's particular recommendations, follow those up. And also document the lessons learned about evaluation. So that's an overview of it. This is the briefs that are available, so there's more detail on each of these. And a number of them will be the focus of a webinar as well. And there's the URL. I'm going to hand back to Nicola. We have a bit of time to look at some questions. Thank you.